Welcome to this week's episode of Dylan's podcast and vlog. Thank you for joining, or if you're listening on the podcast, thank you for downloading this week's episode. It's always good to check in with you once a week. If you've watched or this podcast or vlog or listened for a little while, you know that I'm trying to do this once a week to sort of journal my journey as an entrepreneur, sharing things that I'm learning, things that I'm thinking about in an attempt to connect with other entrepreneurs, as well as flesh out my own thinking. And this week, I'm excited to talk about a topic that coincidentally came up with two entrepreneurs that I've had the opportunity to break bread with over the last couple of weeks. And it got me thinking that I take for granted my context for why I run a business, or why I have a portfolio of businesses and what I'm trying to achieve with my time every day. I take that for granted because meeting these other entrepreneurs who are really in the weeds right now, just running their businesses, it was just a great reminder that maybe this is something that I can talk about to continue to flesh out my reasons for why I do what I do every single day. And as an entrepreneur, it might get you thinking about why you do what you do every single day. There was a tweet that I saw come across yesterday, actually. I'll just do a quick screen share here so that those of you that are watching the video are able to see what I'm looking at. And the tweet was basically a fellow named Patrick had just said, he was talking about how being in business isn't all glory, because he had talked to someone who said they were grinding away, they were stressed out, they could have made more money working for someone else. And I had just highlighted that quote unquote, I could have made more money working for someone else. Quote, this is something I'm always thinking about to ensure I don't waste my time. Know the difference between a hobby and a business. And some days these are things that I'm still learning. And that seems to fit the context of what I wanted to discuss today, which is why even bother having a business? If you've listened to me for some time, I enjoy sharing my thoughts. I enjoy thinking out loud. That's how my brain works. And I also enjoy hearing from other entrepreneurs that listen to these episodes and have feedback or have questions, or we get into conversations about certain things that I'm talking about. So today's, I imagine, is going to be it's going to create some interesting conversations. In the last couple of episodes, I've mentioned something called the cash flow quadrant for business owners. This is something that I've used for years to help me understand how to navigate through a business. And I've recently started producing some content or putting some, sorry, just missed my screen there, or putting out just some ideas around what this means. So again, I'll do a quick screen share here and show you what it looks like. Again, if you're listening to the podcast, there are basically 4 quadrants that make up the cash flow quadrant. And along would be the vertical axis. You have negative profit at the bottom, positive profit at the top. On the horizontal axis, you have no cash on the left and cash in the bank on the right. And basically a business owner or an entrepreneur ends up moving between the 4 quadrants from from left to right to up to left again. And in the bottom left is struggling. You move over to the right, which is bottom right, adjusting. Then you move up to top right, which is growing, and then ultimately top left, which is investing. So basically an entrepreneur moves through these 4 different quadrants. They focus on creating sort of a viable business first, then they focus on creating a profitable business, then they figure out a way to start managing their income and their expenses as they grow, and then ultimately they start focusing on investing their cash. And as I consider what I do every single day as an entrepreneur, this is what I attempt to do. I attempt to work through each of these quadrants, and my history has been spent working with businesses that generally don't get out of the sort of bottom 2 quadrants. They don't get out of the struggling or adjusting quadrants because, quite frankly, it's hard to run a business. As I've always said, entrepreneurs usually don't start businesses because they are mathematicians. They start businesses because they see that they get excited rather about solving a problem in the marketplace with a particular product or a service, and then they just go out and do it. And then if they're at all successful, they then begin to get customers, and when they get customers, they then start to hire people, and they sort of put the wheels on the bus as they go. But there's never really a grand master plan. And so what I wanted to talk about today was why even bother having a business? At the end of the day, what's the point? I think once you get past some of the personal reasons that people will start a business, and that can include they want freedom, They want to have full autonomy or full control over their own outcomes, all the way through to they want to create a lot of wealth and they want to be wealthy, and they think this is one way to do it. And I think that I've observed over my career that the reasons for ultimately starting a business versus working through one and grinding through one versus either selling it or completing it, that those answers change over time. When you get into something, it's often not the same reasons why you get out of it, or vice versa. By the time you're done with your business, whether it has worked out or not, that oftentimes doesn't line up with the reasons why you got into business in the first place. So I thought I would share some of my thoughts on why I'm in business, in hopes that an entrepreneur listening to this would connect and they'd say, "Great, that gives me some context for what I'm doing." And for those entrepreneurs that maybe hear what I say and say, "Well, Dylan, I've got a different take on it. Here's why I'm doing what I'm doing," that maybe I could take something away. So make sure to connect with me through this episode. I will put a link in the cash flow quadrant for business owners down in the show notes, so you can read it yourself, take a look at it, tell me what you think. But I ultimately started a business mostly because I got caught up in this romantic idea of what it meant to be an entrepreneur. In fact, the very first job that I had was in high school, and I worked for a record store owner in a shopping center. And again, I didn't even know what the word entrepreneur meant. I had a couple of business books that I don't even know how I ended up getting them. One of them was, I think that it was from Forbes magazine, and it was like the 50 greatest business stories ever told or something like that. It had like this green and yellow cover on it. And I remember reading just these very short stories of like, people like Bill Gates, Richard Branson, Henry Ford, etc. And I found like the adventure of what it meant to be an entrepreneur very exciting. And then it turns out in high school, I got to go and work for an entrepreneur. And so he would come in, he seemed very confident, absolutely in charge of his world and his time. And for the couple of years that I worked for him, I just got to observe, and I thought, man, running your own business, what a great idea. So I started a business ultimately because I liked the romantic idea of what it meant to be a business owner, the romantic notion of being in control of your own destiny. For me, there was never a single thought that I had, unfortunately, because it probably would have served me well, but I never at all thought about becoming independently wealthy by being an entrepreneur. It honestly was this romantic idea that you could go and create something out of nothing. You could be your own boss. And then as the years went on, I realized that you need a lot more than just a romantic idea to keep you going. And over time, I did learn by studying. I read a lot of biographies. I love hearing people's stories. And so over time, I started formulating a plan, and I ran a pretty successful business, and then it ran into the ground because of the financial crisis. And I've talked about that on other podcast episodes. And it took me probably the better part of almost a decade to kind of figure out who I am, what I'm doing, how did I get here, and then began working with other entrepreneurs to help them turn around their businesses. And then in the last couple of years have now focused on building my own portfolio of businesses. So that's kind of been my particular arc. And as I work through the cash flow quadrant, I am right now between adjusting and growing. So if I look at my portfolio right now, the businesses that I have, we are just crossing that line into growth. We've found a way to be viable. So the businesses are viable, and that's defined by profitability and cash available in the bank. And then as we survive COVID and have now figured out that what the world's going to look like, notwithstanding inflation and interest rates and supply chain problems and all that other sort of stuff, now we're figuring out how to play to our strengths. And in the last couple of episodes, I've talked about really trying to understand how to leverage our assets really well, how to direct our teams and the people on our teams really well, and just sort of build one day at a time until collectively we've found a way to consistently grow our business. And so I've been learning different business models. I think the business models are different from maybe when I first started in business. Work from home is a pretty big deal. Millennials and now Gen Z are a pretty big deal, and they change how you structure a business. And so I'm really kind of working through that right now. I'm 44 years old. And so I'm trying to figure out how to apply all of my lessons learned, both personally and professionally, into figuring out how to build a really great portfolio of businesses that ultimately, as I make my way from growing into investing on the quadrant, that I am able to take the profits that these businesses generate and just keep multiplying them out exponentially. And the reason I do that is because it does cater to well, first of all, I've been doing it for so long that it just sort of becomes part of who you are. But if I had to break the answer down a little bit more, I would say running a business for me has done the things that I've thought about. So it's given me the freedom, but it has come with responsibility. It's given me the financial ups and the financial downs. And over time, I hope to smooth those out. So instead of them bouncing so much year to year to year, that I can make those vibrations shorter and smaller, and then ultimately be in a position to take businesses that could be doing so much more than what they have and putting money into them so that they can realize on that. And a business really is only two things: it's people and it's resources. And an entrepreneur, as opposed to maybe a CEO or a president or someone that fills a formal spot on an org chart, I think an entrepreneur's job is really to try and create something out of nothing, or to take something and make it something more. And that's by having the vision, having the interest, right? Because when your own money is at stake and your own time is at stake, you're going to look at that differently than if you were simply collecting a paycheck every other week or every month, or management fees or something like that. And so I see an opportunity to use my skills as I go forth to take the excess cash that our portfolio generates and put it into other businesses that can generate excess cash. But because a business is really just people and resources, I happen to really enjoy people. I enjoy the people that I currently have on the teams that I'm responsible for. I enjoy using resources and trying to figure out how to get more out of them and you've heard me talk about software and APIs and how I'm trying to do that in my businesses right now, practically on the ground. And I think going forward, there's going to be this transition of a lot of maybe more traditional businesses that aren't by default technology enabled, but because technology has become so cheap and so easy to use, I think there are going to be businesses where there are really great people in the business. The business is solving a real problem in the marketplace, but it needs to be refreshed, or it needs to be upgraded, or it just needs someone to come in with some fresh ideas. And I think that if you have the ability to do it, I think you should try to contribute your skills to a meaningful venture, which I think businesses are. And again, because I love people, because I love resources, because I love the whole idea of being an entrepreneur, I really am looking forward to what might come over the next couple of years out of a portfolio. My on-demand labor service that we've spun up now 2 months ago or 3 months ago is starting to take on a life of its own. And so now I'm looking at getting better people in place to do the jobs that I've been doing with some help, and now looking to grow that. But why own a business in the first place? Because I think it's the best, most meaningful way for me to spend my time, for me to utilize my skills and my experience. And ultimately, I think that I can produce a better result taking people and resources and putting them together and trying to leverage them to solve a problem than just maybe pulling up a chair and working on one opportunity on its own. I think if you look at some of the most successful entrepreneurs in history, they really became passionate about making sure that they were not just delivering a product or service, but ultimately they saw themselves as being able to make a real difference in society, in culture. If you go back to, or as far back as you go, I mean, hospitals, schools, libraries, museums, these are things that on their own generally don't get started by anything other than philanthropy or benevolent people that say, look, I think these things are important. I think it's important to take care of people. I think it's important that people have access to art and people have access to creative ideas and creative venues and experiences. And so they do that. And I think if we're blessed as entrepreneurs to be able to create something out of nothing, that we then have a responsibility to take whatever those results are and continue to leverage them. And there's that old saying that there's sort of two steps, right? You go from 0 to 1. So you take, nothing and turn it into something. And then you take something and exponentially grow it, which is 1 to N. And that's what I'm trying to do. And why? Because I think it's worth it. Because I think that the outcome of let me say it a different way. Having been born where I'm born, having been given the opportunities that I've been given, having been blessed with the great relationships and the tough relationships I've had, I feel that there's a responsibility to make the most of those. I remember, this would have been back in the late 90s. There was a fella that hired me that I continue to see on a very regular basis, where we invest in deals together. And I'd asked him when I just started working for him a few years, and I said, why did you ever even bother taking me on? I don't have a formal education. I I'm making mistakes all the time. And he just said to me, look back, I remember we were in the car and he just said, one day you're going to do the same thing. You're going to invest in someone else. You're going to give them an opportunity, and then they're going to do the same thing. And if everyone was to do that, can you imagine the kind of world we would live in? And so I think that's why I own a business. I think that's why any entrepreneur should consider owning a business, because once you get past the rewards of having some stability and some consistency and your ego and your pride and everything, kind of all the boxes are check, 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 check. What do you do after that? Well, there are no pockets in your casket, so you're going to have to do something with your money. Of course, you can leave it to your family and build generational wealth, and I'm still trying to figure out what that means for our family or what my thoughts on it are. But today, I think a lot about simply being able to exponentially take what I have and do more with it, because there are a lot of people out there that really do have great skills. If you could find them, put them into a business, marry them with really great resources that you could not only give a meaningful solution to the marketplace with a great product or a great service, but more importantly, you can help people do what they're really great at. So you might be able to hire a really great accountant. In our business, you might be able to hire really great construction workers or heavy duty mechanics and give them a life that they might not have otherwise had, or work with them to create a life that they wouldn't have otherwise had, and help them provide for their families. And if you can provide for their families, that means they're probably living in healthy communities, and healthy communities continue to give people upward opportunity. And so I just think it's I think it's an obligation that if we're blessed enough to be able to go and run these businesses, start them, frustrate our way through them, get the rewards, good and bad, from them, there's an opportunity to keep moving through it. So back to this cash flow quadrant for business owners, if you need context, the business owners I was sitting with are like, look, we got through the struggling stage, we got through the adjusting stage, now we're in the growing stage, but we don't really know why we're growing. What are we trying to work towards? So by showing them that, well, naturally you move from growing to investing, that already started creating a lot of interesting conversation, because all of a sudden they're thinking to themselves and talking out loud and discussing, well, what would I invest in? Well, I invest in my family. I'd invest in my personal net worth. Okay, but is that enough? Do you want more than that? One of the individuals said, actually, if I was able to generate, if our business was able to grow, but then I was actually able to take the money out of the business because there was more money being generated than what the business actually needed. And that becomes very tricky. And that might be another podcast episode. But if I was able to generate excess cash over and above what our business is required, and that put me in that investing quadrant, what would I invest in? I could invest back in our businesses, but I could invest in the community. I could invest in other causes. And he had some ideas about what he would do. He happens to think very highly of underprivileged families, and he had thought that there would be an opportunity to put some scholarships together or some funding together so that underserved families would be able to put their kids in sports programs. And that was sort of a big thing for him, because sports is something that really was influential in helping him become the individual that he's been. But all of a sudden, you could see in these conversations I was having that just by asking the question, it began giving them some context for maybe why they're getting up every single day. Because as business owners, we just get up and we just start going. But when you don't have context for what you're doing, or you don't have a destination you're trying to work towards, it can be frustrating. The down days can be really hard, right? Especially if you've worked through a few economic cycles, you just get burned out and worn out. But then you also hit just some impasses. One entrepreneur I was sitting with, he's had 2 business partners for almost 20 years. None of them are interested in getting rid of anyone else, because nobody wants to cut the check to the other guy. So what do? They just show up every day and they do their job and they generate the revenue. But 3 of them are not as happy together as any one of them could be individually if someone just made the first move, but nobody wants to. So as I was challenging him, and I said, well, if you don't really have a ton of financial upside by staying in the business, and, you could exercise some of your buy-sell agreements, what would you do? And he says, you know what? That's probably part of the problem. He said, if I did end up getting bought out, it'd be fun for a minute, but then I would have to decide what I want to do. And so maybe it's easier just to show up every day and keep working. And that's an answer. I think that answer is probably more common than not. But in my little episode today, I thought I would just sort of break open the reasons why I do it. I get excited by the opportunity of creating something out of nothing, of solving hard problems, of trying to be innovative and creative, but ultimately trying to find people and resources that I can work with to get a better result by putting them together than they would have had individually. And for me, I find it intellectually interesting. I find it meaningful because if you can find good people and work with good people and see them succeed, there's just an enormous amount of reward that is non-monetary that comes out of that, that does in fact make everything worthwhile. And it provides context. You know, I wake up every day trying to figure out how can I lead and serve our teams well, and how can I make sure that nobody is falling short because of me, and nobody is falling short because our businesses don't have what they need to succeed. And that doesn't mean we have everything we need and we have all of the resources and all of the money we need. No, but it gives me context for what I should be spending my time on every day and why I'm doing it, because I'm trying to move from the growth quadrant or the growing quadrant up into the investing quadrant. And that's all I'm thinking about. Okay, so as I make that leap, then what would I invest in? If we were successful in selling one of our businesses, then what would I do? What would I do with the cash? Well, the answer is I go buy another business or invest in another business. Might not start another business, but I probably invest in an existing one. And then the answer becomes, well, why would I do that? And it's because I would like to fix the business. I get a lot of pleasure out of seeing something that's broken get put back together and work. But I also get a lot of satisfaction from watching people really thrive in a role and in an environment that works for them. And I like people. I just like seeing people do what they do. And people have done that for me for no other reason except to see me succeed and to be a part of my story. And I find that that's very rewarding doing it the other way. And investing just means we get it. We have a mechanism for checking our math and making sure, keeping score, if you will. That's the term I was looking for. So why go from 0 to 1 and 1 to n and make money? And because money is just the bar, it just sort of helps you keep score, but it's not the actual reason itself. There are other things that we do. And for some of you listening to this might be the first time you've ever even considered things like this. I would strongly encourage you to look at that cash flow quadrant and picture it in your head and try to figure out how you're going to move yourself. Because if you don't move yourself through the quadrants, what I've realized through different phases of my career is you can get stuck, you can get depressed, you can start filling up with despair because you're not quite sure how to get unstuck from one quadrant to the other, and it gets very difficult getting out of bed. But once you have the whole picture in front of you, I've learned that entrepreneurs are very innovative and creative individuals, and they are able to come up with reasons and for why they're doing what they're doing. And for me, that cash flow quadrant tool has always been just a great way to do that, and I'm trying to share it with you. So that's all I've got for this week's episode. Normally I would share some tweets, but I think that I'll just park this idea where it is with you. Again, would love to hear from you. If you're an entrepreneur, make sure to reach out through LinkedIn or through Twitter or through email. I do this to hear myself talk, but I also do it to try and connect with other entrepreneurs in just a very straightforward and practical way. So thank you for tuning into this week's episode, and I hope to hear from you, and hope that you'll check in next week as well.